Hello, and welcome to the virtual Comic-Con at Home Prototypes and Game Pitches panel. I'm joined with a lot of lovely panelists, and we're going to be talking about how to publish your tabletop game and get it in front of publishers in 2020. I'm Ross Thompson. I'm a marketing manager at the Op, and I'm really excited to be moderating this panel. Jon?
Yeah, hey, I am Jon Cohn. I'm a game designer behind games like Munchkin Ninja Turtles, Grindhouse, and Alchemists. I'm also one half of Bread and Circuses, which is a design studio.
Eric?
Hello, I am Eric Slauson. I am a party and social game designer for the most part. I have Tattoo Stories, Nerd Word Science, and the upcoming Monstrosity with Deepwater Games and Bread and Circuses.
Pat?
I'm Pat Marino, the game design manager at the Op. I've helped develop and work on some of the titles behind me, and also games like Court of the Dead and a bunch of really awesome stuff coming later this year.
Juliana?
I'm Juliana Moreno-Patel. I'm one half of the Wild Optimists, and we do puzzle and game design for tabletop games, live action events, theme parks, all sorts of places. We currently have Escape Room in a Box on the market, both the Werewolf Experiment and Flashback.
Cool. Ariel?
I'm Ariel Rubin. I am the other half of the Wild Optimists.
Awesome. There's a good chance, Juliana, I'm going to ask you about the pizza thing you guys did for the vampire a little bit, because when I saw that pop up, I was like, oh, that's really cool.
Vampires and pizza, why not?
Why not, right?
No garlic.
There is a puzzle about that, actually.
So the last con a lot of us was at was Gamma. Back in March, and then when COVID-19 hit, that really has changed the industry across the board, from manufacturing being shut down or put on pause, and game stores being closed, distribution closing down. A lot of publishers that have in-house things, everybody's been at home now, and conventions are being canceled. There's a lot that's changing in the industry. A lot more things are going online and virtual, just like how our panel is happening here. But how has that affected prototype building and publishing, networking, trying to get your game in front of publishers? There's a lot going on with that, because the games are still coming out and being produced, and people are preparing for 21 and 22, and also games on Kickstarter and self-publishing. So how does someone get and keep moving during this time right now? Open question.
Well, a lot of it's on Zoom. We've been building out a lot of networks and game nights that have been able to host on Zoom. One thing that I've learned, and I don't know if this is everyone else's experience, people don't really own printers in their homes that much anymore. And so when this first happened, I started building out prototypes that were easy print and plays. And so I was like, oh, I'll make these print and plays. And then I reached out to my network, and it turned out no one had printers. So it was like, okay, new plan. One person needs to have a printer, be able to run a game, and everybody else, basically we'd come up with games that are pen and paper friendly. So that's been my reality for the last few months, is a lot of pen and paper, and then me with a bunch of cards, or digitally sharing my screen on Zoom.
We've also been doing that as well, and same thing with the shock of how few people own printers. I guess game designers all own printers, and we're like, of course you have a printer. But we've been doing a lot. We tried Tabletopia and moved over to Tabletop Simulator. So it's been a question of like, can we do a workshop in Tabletop Simulator and do testing that way? But what we've often done is had the game running on Tabletop Simulator with the cards, but then also have a Zoom going so everyone can see each other's faces and do private chats, because that's a big part of gaming for us and the games that we create. So running the two simultaneously has been how we've been doing a lot of testing lately.
And just to add on to that, I think it's been really interesting to see that in testing, the first hurdle you have to get past is the tech stuff. So it's not just like, does someone have a printer? Do they have a color printer? Do they have Tabletop Simulator, which costs money? Can they figure out how to use Tabletop Simulator, which like took me a couple times to just figure out, oh wait, can someone see my card right now, or can they not see my card? Like so there's been, testing has taken longer because you have to get through the tech barrier and then start testing the game.
Yeah, I've definitely found that to be true. Oh, go ahead, Eric.
I was just going to say, with Tabletop Simulator or Tabletopia, Games Arena, all of those, one thing that I have seen is if you can get past that, the barrier of entry for finding playtesters has been a lot lower. Like you can literally tweet out like, hey, does anybody want to test this game I'm working on? And like strangers will come, play your game. So if you're, comfortable with giving early access to some rough prototypes, there are people who have nothing better to do than to play your game. So and they're great for being able to get playtesters, because normally we have to wait. A lot of us have to wait for like an unpub or a proto spiel, and then try to test as much as we can and beg people to come to the table. And this has made it a lot easier in some ways.
Yeah, I think it's pushed people to learn some of those systems in a way that they avoided before. And I know even like internally, we could build our prototypes out in those systems, but we all work in the same building. It's easier to just turn around and place something in the building. And now that we can't do that, we had to put a lot more research into, can we test on Tabletop Simulator and Tabletopia? Can we do that with licensed games where you have an IP art issue? And in most cases you can't. So do we do generic versions with no art and no, character names and kind of fake it that way? We've had to get really clever with using like, I've got like this magnifier light I use for some hobby stuff, but, mount my phone on that. So I've got a top down view of the game here. And then the person I'm playing with also has a prototype at their house. And we're kind of, looking at games where you're not pulling from the same deck and things like that we can play just using Zoom, and having sort of the game be its own window. So we've had to find a lot of creative things like that. And even within our team, like, I think we've been so spoiled that in the office we have, wide format printers and 3D printers and basically anything you could want for prototyping. So there was never any need to have that at home. I had it when I was doing independent design, but now I don't. And so working from home, it's sort of like, okay, do I drive, the hour and 15 minutes to the office, print stuff off, mock it all up, and then bring it back? And so we have this like ongoing exchange of, well, when I was there, I made 3 copies of the game. So when you're there, make sure you grab one and take it home and play with your family and things like that. So it's been really interesting to see how everyone's adapting, but also how that adapting, I think, will help us in the future, even when we can be in the same place, that, we don't always have to wait for the unpub or wait for, Gen Con to meet up and play something together and see a demo. There's more familiarity with these systems now that we can do it in between.
Sure.
So you bring up a good point, Pat, and Eric, you too, where you said that like right now you can just tweet out and be like, hey, who wants to come play my prototype and do this thing? Do you think that's opened the doors for a lot of new designers to get more playtest feedback?
I think so. A few weeks ago went to the Con of Champions, which is like an online convention, similar to an Unpub or Protospiel. There were some published games that people were running games of online, but mostly it was people's prototypes. And there were a lot of first-time designers there. There were actually a lot of people who were saying that was their first ever convention, which I thought was really cool. Again, talking about that barrier of entry, you don't have to spend $700 to go play games that aren't real. So yeah, I think it has opened it up a little bit to new people from all walks of life in the hobby.
I think
go ahead.
I was just going to say, I think another reason why a lot of people are getting into the hobby and creating things right now is because they've been at home for 3 months and there's boredom. And so if you've got, a friend or a loved one that you're living with, or even just doing it online, and you have board games sitting around your house, or it's easy to buy board games online, it's very easy to pass the time. I've had a couple of friends reach out to me who are not normally board gamers and say, I'm only familiar with Clue and Monopoly. What should I get right now to play with my girlfriend at home? And so that, I think, has really breathed a lot of fresh life into the industry, just out of boredom.
And I think it's also given people a much wider circle of people to play with. So whereas before you might have had someone who was willing to test, but they didn't have a group that was there that would come to their house and test with them, now they can have, their sister who lives across the country, she's part of it, and their mom and dad down in Florida. So the fact that people can now play with anyone, anywhere, has really opened the door to just a lot more playtest groups being available.
think from the pitch side too, you know, working at a publisher, we get to see a lot of inventor submissions, and normally the conventions are like the big time to do that, right? And if you can get a meeting and you can get to the show and you can pay for the hotel and all those kinds of things, you kind of end up with a leg up over other designers, because we can talk face to face and see your prototype and you can talk us through it and all those kinds of things. But I think absent that this year, we've been doing everything through video. So we have a shared folder where inventors can basically, through our director of inventor relations, Tony Cerbriani, they can send him their video, which can be a 3-minute pitch. Here's my game, pretty informal, doesn't have to be edited and all that. And we just keep a running thing in there where everybody's sort of on this equal playing field of, you know, for the time it takes you to film something with your iPhone, you can have this video that we can watch. And our whole team can evaluate your game and decide, like, okay, do we want your prototype? Is this something we want to advance into the line and look at? So it's been interesting to see how, you know, we had sort of a steady group of people who would submit stuff to us, and I'm seeing a lot of new names on that list and in that folder, submitting things that, you know, maybe they wouldn't have otherwise, because they would have thought, well, if I can't make it to Gen Con, I can't make a pitch. And so I'm hoping that's creating more access for more designers to get good games out there.
And I'd be curious, is there, for first-time designers, is there any sort of like vetting process? Do all submissions, as long as they can get the access to the portal, all submissions will be fully evaluated by the team, or is there kind of a first guard?
I mean, every publisher handles it a little differently. I know the way we tend to do it is just about everything that gets submitted goes into that folder. It's just a Google folder where we can access and look at things. And we have a rating system that every game goes through to get like a score. And then from there, after we've seen like a pitch video, we decide which prototypes we want to bring in house and actually play and maybe progress with through a contract and things like that. The only things we tend not to put through the process are games that we just know from the beginning it's just not an op game, right? So like an RPG, or, you know, a high cost, large scale, like Warhammer type of game. It doesn't really fit with the kind of stuff we normally produce. So if we get things like that, or really heavy Euros, sometimes we just at quick glance say, you know, this isn't going to be for us. But we've looked at a lot of party games, mass friendly games, games with license potential. And I can say we really don't screen anything before it goes to the whole team, because, you know, the number of videos we've watched that are things like, oh, it's Cards Against Humanity, but with a different name and things like that. But we want to make sure like everyone's opinion is heard and that we really consider, because we all play different types of games. We all have different preferences. And so we don't want to miss any, you know, game with great potential because one person's opinion doesn't really fit that game.
So that's a really good point you bring up, Pat. So when pitching to a publisher, like there's a lot of different publishers that do different stuff across the board. There's ones that focus on RPGs. There's some that focus on fun party games. Others are heavy Euros. What recommendations would you give to publishers or to designers that are looking to get their game in front of publishers? Like what sort of research should they do, and where should they be looking for that kind of information?
Yeah, I mean, when I did freelance design and before I would go to a show and make appointments to pitch games, I was always looking at, you know, does the game I have fit with like the weight of game, the price point of game that the publisher does? Is the theme kind of in line with the types of themes they do? You know, it's like, I remember being at Gen Con with Gem Hens actually, which is behind me. And it was there's like a speed dating event that used to happen there where you just pitched, you have 6 minutes to pitch to publisher after publisher. It's just a rotating thing for about 2 hours. And Catalyst Labs came through and looked at it. And if you know their games, like chickens and kind of a goofy theme, it just doesn't fit what they do at all. But when they saw the pitch, because they have to, right? They had to go through the rotation. Their response was like, we like it anyway. We can't publish it, but let's make some introductions tomorrow to people who can. That's not really a strategy per se. And you don't want to schedule somebody's time and kind of force them to hear your pitch if it's not a fit. But it's also knowing, you know, who can help you network and who can help you build those relationships with the companies that will take the game seriously and who can do something really good with it. Because the other side of it too is, you know, if you have that heavy tactical game and you bring it to a publisher who's never done that before, not only are they going to likely pass, but if they do take the game, they likely don't know how to market it or get it into the right communities and get the right attention on it. So it might not be the best place for your game to flourish. The flip side is if you have the hottest new party game that anyone's ever seen, you're going to want to show it to a company that has games at mass, that can reach a really broad audience so that it gets the full attention and reach that a game like that really should have. So it's doing your research and looking at their website. What do they sell? What do they publish? What are their hottest games that they've done the best with? And kind of finding that fit both thematically and mechanically.
And then I would add to that and this isn't something that we've had to do. We got our start on Kickstarter, and then one of the people from Mattel was one of our backers, and that's how we got our games to Mattel. And since then we've met people. But the way we got people to review our Kickstarter game in the first place, and I imagine that this holds true when you are submitting to publishers, is we read all the blogs and we would write a letter that said, our game, we think you will like our game and that you should review our game because you reviewed this other game that is similar and you liked it. So to follow on your point, if you're submitting a game and you're submitting it to the right company and that because it does have a similar price point and it is a similar game, I put that in the first paragraph, I love your games and this is why I'm submitting it to you.
Yeah, it's really important. We get emails sometimes where it's, the subject line or something is another publisher's name, or it's just very generic and you see 7 other publishers copied on it and you kind of go, is this really a pitch to us, or is this just a blanket approach to throw a game at everyone who will listen?
Yeah, and there's a lot of different publishers out there that people may not be aware of, and so the easiest way to find out if a publisher is making the games that you like or the games that you're trying to make is by going to their websites and literally just looking at their products list. I found a couple of publishers that I've now worked with that I was unaware existed prior to doing some research. I know it's not convenient right now because we don't have any huge conventions coming up, but you can actually find backlogged versions of Origins or Gen Con vendor lists online. And you just literally go through that list of every single publisher, even if you've never heard of them, and you go to their website and you look at what they've done. And just like you were saying, you make it very clear in the email, I think this game is, good for your lineup because you made this game, which was great. So that was a really good way of finding new publishers that, you may not already be aware of.
And you should, of course, be doing your research. Whatever type of game you're making, you should be playing all of that type of game that's out there. So if you're already doing your research and playing all those games, you should have a stack of games in your house. And then you just take a look and see who published all of these games that my game is in that similar style.
That said, if you have a game that's very specific, you don't necessarily want to pitch it to the same publisher who has that same exact game. If I had a game that was very similar to Hues and Cues, I probably wouldn't take it to the op and say, hey, you guys published this one about colors, I have another one about colors. So that's something I keep in mind as well.
Juliana, sorry. Do you want to? I didn't mean to interrupt.
Oh, no, go for it.
Okay. I was going to say, Juliana and I come out of a writing background, and I once heard a showrunner say that what everyone wants when you pitch a TV show is the exact same thing, but veered slightly to the left. And I would imagine that that's, a similar strategy could be applied. You want to, look for a publisher that is kind of like that game, but your game is slightly to the left, fits the catalog, but isn't exactly the same.
Yeah, great example of that is, we have Telestrations, which is our top game, right? And everybody has likely seen it or heard about it. It's been in mass for a number of years now. And when King Klinko brought us what became Telestrations Upside Drawn, it was very much that. It's it's a drawing and guessing game where there's some element of communication, miscommunication, and confusion with the drawing. But it takes that kind of thing of Telestration and turns it and gives you a different experience where you're playing in teams and it's speed based and the person who's actually drawing doesn't know what the keyword is, and it was very easy for us to see not only is this a fit, it's a fit within that product line, that's different enough that it's not going to derail sales of the core product. It's going to add to the brand and expand it. On the flip side, like we've had some things where we've considered like another deck building game, and we have the Hogwarts Battle Engine, and that's been very successful for us. And we've seen some submissions or had some things presented to us that were too similar, that we kind of looked at and went, well, what would we do to make this different enough from Hogwarts Battle that it's its own game that can stand apart from it? Or would we be better off just taking a new license and starting from Hogwarts Battle? And in those kinds of circumstances, it comes down to, well, the thing we have is likely easier for us than a very similar thing that we don't have yet.
So going back to the website bit and the vendor list, after you found the vendor or the publisher that you want to pitch to, what would you recommend? So in 2020 right now, we can't go to Origins, we can't go to Gen Con. What would you recommend to do to go track down that publisher to pitch your game?
First of all, you got to find their email address. A lot of publishers also on their websites have a submission portal built into the website, and they'll usually have very specific requirements. One thing that most publishers that have a portal require a sell sheet. It doesn't have to be beautiful. It doesn't have to be really pretty. But it does need to explain in one page the 10-second elevator pitch. It's this many players, it takes this long, and this is, why my game is great. And it needs to be clear and concise and short. And that is something that pretty much any publisher is going to want to see that. Even if you're meeting with them in person, they're still going to want that because they need to have a reminder after the meeting what they just saw. And a sell sheet accomplishes that. Some publishers will want to see a video. Videos can't hurt. It can never hurt to have a video of you explaining and showing off your game. It's much clearer. It's much easier. And you can show it really easy to somebody else and say, hey, I watched this pitch video. What's your take? And they're going to see the exact same thing you did. So those are the two things that I always try to do when I'm putting together a pitch.
Eric?
One thing while you're crafting emails, especially if you're cold emailing a publisher whose email you found online, this is something that I did not learn until kind of a year into my design journey, and I've probably had a lot of emails sent straight to the trash. But normally do not have an attachment in your first outreach email. So seems logical, like, oh, I'm just going to go ahead and show you my game and say, hey, check this out. Here's the video link. Here's the whatever. But a lot of publishers, especially publishers who work in the IP space or, just in general, just to protect themselves and to protect you, they don't want to open something that is similar to something they're already working on. So then you can say, oh, you stole my idea from an email or whatever. So unless they kind of solicit a sell sheet from you, then don't attach anything in that first email. The first email is more, as Ariel said, and Juliana, hey, we like your games, or I like your games. I have something similar, maybe an elevator pitch. It kind of works like this. Is that something you'd be interested in? And then either they will never respond to you, or they'll say that doesn't sound like something for us, or yeah, sure, send us something. But for the most part, if you attach something the first time, you're not going to get a response because they will auto-delete it.
I would say you also want to keep up with all of your contacts. So any conventions that you've ever been to, any emails you've ever gathered, and even if there's emails that you've sent that never got a response, maybe, down the line you can come back and be like, hey, I know I sent you this. I now have this published game on the market, and it's doing well and blah, blah, blah. And I now have this other game that I thought you might be interested in. So as much as you can build up that network and communication, the better. And we find any excuse to email people. I'm sure we'll be sending them this panel and saying, hey, thought you might be interested in checking out this panel. So any interesting news updates that you can give, keep that list of people you've met so that you keep up the communication.
Sure. And this is for long term as well. When we do start going back to conventions and you're doing a lot of this in person, but it still holds for things that you have over Zoom or contacts that you make on Twitter or Facebook. Like, my advice is always kind of look for the connections as like people, like, and as friends and as like actual connections instead of just like, wheeling and dealing business wise. Because a lot of, one of the things that I learned as a designer and going to conventions and meeting publishers is like, they're people. You don't think about, a company, being run by individual people, but, a lot of the games that I have been signed were because I met somebody and we just liked each other as people. And then they, said, hey, are you working on anything? And then, I got to pitch to them. And so it's a big industry, but it's also very small. So again, kind of similar to how Pat was saying, like not sending an email to 10 publishers, that's a form letter. Really think about these as like personal connections, participate in Twitter chats and Facebook groups. And if somebody can recognize your name or your face or your profile pic or whatever, like you have a much higher chance of them kind of wanting to engage with you on a personal or professional level. A lot of people like to work with people they know and people they like. So, yeah.
And circling back to what you said all the way before, playtest right now. Like people are going online and finding playtesters, on Tabletop Simulator. So be one of those playtesters, because that's a great way to get to know maybe not publishers, but other designers. And then if you guys become friends and you have something in the future, you can say, hey, can you take a look? Can you give me advice? I wouldn't necessarily start by asking them to get you to a publisher, ask for advice. And then if they like the game, like they know, we know if somebody asks us for advice on a game, they want us, if we like it, they would like us to help them get to the next step. So, you get that advice and then they can help you meet people and network.
Yeah, I think so much of that comes into, whether working with people or working with people that are going to be easy to work with, right, is a big part of it. And it's hard in a creative endeavor because, especially in a first game, if you finally come up with a game that you're really proud of, really excited about, and you start bringing it to publishers, there's an emotional attachment to that design, right? And, I think one of the pitfalls people fall into is, they bring it to a publisher with the idea that like, this game is done and perfect and nothing should ever change about it. And then a publisher tries to give them advice, based on what they know of the industry and what sells and what performs and those kinds of things. And they're resistant to it. And that's a really good way to end a relationship with a publisher very quickly, is to show like any kind of really like argumentative nature or anything that shows that you're going to be difficult to work with on a product, is a barrier you don't want. And especially as a first-time designer pitching, it's all about building that reputation and those relationships. If you build a great one and show that you're great to work with, and then you go to that publisher again with your second game, they might say, yeah, that's not a fit for us, but you should really show it to our friends over here, who might do something great with that. And they're willing to recommend you and vouch for you with another publisher, or help you make those connections in the industry. But if the first game kind of is bumpy and there's a lot of, back and forth and argument, that first game could become the last game with that publisher. And then, word can get around of like, well, yeah, their games are okay, but it's a long process to work with them to get it over the finish line. So I would say just be open to feedback, be open to accepting any advice and knowledge you might get from people in the industry. The same way with playtesting, right, is, listen to all the feedback. It's not a time to argue with people, it's a time to learn. And I think if you come into it with that idea of like, whether it's the first game or the 50th game, there's something to learn from each one. That will really help the reputation you have as a designer and make more publishers want to work with you.
If I could just If I just piggyback on what Pat had said about emotion, I just wanted to make sure that, like, when you send out these emails or whatever it is, a lot of time they won't respond, sometimes ever. Or if they do, they'll say, we're not interested, we're going to pass. You can't take it personally. If you think that this is like the greatest game, it's your magnum opus and you love it so dearly and you think, how could this publisher not want this game? It fits right into their catalog. you can't take it personally. They're sitting there with a huge mountain of submissions that they're going through. And sometimes there's just not enough time in the day. Sometimes things get lost. It slips through the cracks. Or you have a meeting with somebody and then they say, we've decided we're not going to publish it. You can't say, well, I'm not going to work with those guys. Those people are jerks. At the end of the day, we are all people. We all have our own goals and things, and we only have so much bandwidth. So just, if it didn't come together in this game, like I think Ariel, you had said, come back with your next game and say, look, I know it didn't work out last time, but here's a new product. Here's a new thing. Let's try this again.
Ariel?
Yeah, I was just going to combine the 2 points Pat made. I think, if you start working with a publisher, obviously they want to have a part of the game too. This is also going to be something that they love and that, they're putting a lot behind. So you may disagree with some notes. Juliana and I we talk about like what hills to die on. So, for me, I tend to think, I'm the designer. I care a lot about the mechanics. I care a lot about how the game is played. I care about the art, but at the end of the day, that's the publisher to me. That's my opinion. Like, and also the rule book. I know I'm the designer. I know that my rule books are in my head. So hopefully the publisher can help with that. So, we've seen art before that we've thought was not our favorite, but it's fine. Probably the publisher knows better. They're putting out a lot of games and they probably have a better idea of what is going to sell and what's going to look good than I do. In terms of mechanics, publishers, publishers have different ideas. And sometimes you're like, oh my gosh, why didn't I think of that? And sometimes you're like, I really don't think that's going to work. But the great thing about mechanic ideas is they can be play tested. And everyone understands play testing. So there's no reason to die on that hill. You just say, okay, cool, let's play test it. And,
Point.
Well, I kind of got lost in these conversations here. I have more questions, and I'm like, oh, these are all, just keep going, guys. This is good. So one of the next questions I had on here was, so sometimes when you're getting ready to pitch your game to a publisher, the idea comes along that you could just kickstart it yourself. And that sometimes has a whole different avenue you got to go down. I already saw some faces from just bringing that up. Thoughts on that?
So we've gone both ways. We started on Kickstarter and then we licensed our game. And all of our subsequent games we have sold to publishers. And there's a reason for that for us. Time is very limited, and manufacturing, first off, running a Kickstarter, but then everything that comes after it, if you are lucky enough to be successful, manufacturing and doing all of the press and everything takes so much time. And you have to decide, do you want to be a game designer or do you want to be a game publisher? And there's some people who are both and they're amazing at it. But for us, our true love is design, and we want to spend our time designing. And so we are more than willing to partner up with publishers and have them take care of all the other aspects of putting a game out into the world so that we can focus on what we love. Because to do a Kickstarter and do a Kickstarter well is a giant endeavor.
Yeah,
and
I think there's go for it.
I'm just the quick add-on to that is I don't know buyers at Target. There's a reason publishers exist and they have the relationships, and that is awesome. And I'm just so happy that I don't have to try to make those other relationships. And I'm so happy I don't have to deal with manufacturing.
Yeah, but basically, I feel like the question you have to ask when you're trying to think between running a Kickstarter or going to a publisher is, do I have time for another full-time job? Because that's what you're getting yourself into if you're going to try and run properly a Kickstarter campaign. And it's a very different set of skills. If you're somebody who's very creative and design focused, that means you might not be really great at analytics and business and running a business. And that's what you have to do in order to successfully run a Kickstarter.
Yeah.
Eric? Hold on. Eric, you had
I was just going to Juliana's point that, and John as well, you are, when you're running a Kickstarter, becoming a publisher. You're doing, for all intents and purposes, all of the stuff. You're doing the figuring out the art direction. You're doing all the marketing. You're finding your own reviewers and previewers and videographers and all that stuff. So either that's what you want to do, and you think that's something that you can sustain with the rest of your work-life balance. But sometimes I think a lot of times, speaking personally, the times that I have considered Kickstarter are the times when I got frustrated that something I had wasn't getting picked up, and I know this is a good game, and I'm pitching it around, and everybody keeps saying, why don't you Kickstart it? Why don't you Kickstart it? And I feel like every time I have gotten close, it has been the time a game has gotten signed, and I'm like, I don't have to do that now. So kind of keep going at it, but do not take it lightly. Not even having run it, but being very close to people who have run Kickstarters, it is a whole thing. So.
Yeah, I was just going to say, the comment was, do you have time for another full-time job? I'd say it's more than one. When I look at the Court of the Dead Kickstarter that we did, we have a whole company, right? And I worked on the game design, but we had an art team that could also do all the graphics for the Kickstarter page. We had a production team that was managing all the back and forth with the factory and making sure all the 3D stuff was done. We had a 3D team that was doing the sculpting. We have a marketing team and a sales team who knows how to get games into distribution and handle that way with, extra print run and all those kinds of things. So looking at it from that big picture of there's no way that I could have done all that myself in the way that it was done to the level it was done. And I think, looking at it now, having had that experience, I think, okay, how much would I have had to pay all those people to help me? Right. Yeah. And to get this thing over the line. And then you look at the cost of production of a high-end Kickstarter game and all those kinds of things. Because the argument people always made to me when I was independent, they're like, oh, just Kickstart your games. You get to keep all the profit. And I was like, do you know how math works? You look at all these costs, and at the end of the day, it's wow, I put in 4 full-time jobs and made $25. Cool. It was worth it. No, So I think people sometimes, they see those big figures on Kickstarter for the really big campaigns, and they think that's all profit. And it's it's marketing spends, it's distribution, it's, production, it's shipping, it's all those things that get eaten away. And at the end of the day, if you're lucky, maybe you make part of a salary. There's no benefits that come with that, right? And you're not getting healthcare out of your Kickstarter. So I don't think it's quite the opportunity at fortune that people sometimes see it as when they just see that big funding number on the page. They're not seeing all the math that kind of goes behind that and the risk that comes with it. Whereas when you go with a publisher, especially if you get a minimum guarantee on your contract, it's sort of okay, I get this royalty, and no matter what happens, I get at least this much out of the deal. And I have zero risk because I'm not paying for the print run, I'm not paying for the marketing. And that's a really nice way to go, especially as you're learning the industry.
All that being said, though, I don't want to be completely down on Kickstarter because it is where we got our start. We knew nobody in the game publishing world. We sent off a lot of emails, not to publishers, but to reviewers and other people in the industry that got zero response. And I'm sure there's a lot of first-time designers out there who don't have any connections, who are not getting responses from their emails. And it can be a really good way to get your game out into the world. And I'm so grateful that we live in a time where we can come up with an idea for a game and someone in Dubai can buy that game, and that'll actually be a transaction that happens. And so I think it's going to be a tricky road to go, and you have to be prepared for the amount of work that is not game design, but that is just pure Kickstarter work. And there's so many amazing resources. The Kickstarter community is fantastic about helping you do it right and run a Kickstarter well, but you just have to be prepared. This is going to be a massive amount of work.
And I also think there's a question that you ask yourself when you run a Kickstarter. It's do you want to run a Kickstarter so that you become a games publisher? After you run the Kickstarter and hopefully succeed, are you going to continue to publish this game, and are you going to be the person behind it publishing it, or is the Kickstarter a calling card to try to get publishers' attention? Because I think that those are two very different things. I think that, you know, look, we ran our Kickstarter. It was a calling card. We got a publisher's attention, which is awesome. Publishers, you know, I assume you guys are too, but publishers are on Kickstarter and, you know, look at the games, buy a lot of the games and play a lot of the games. So that's really great. If you run a Kickstarter and say, oh, I was able to do this, I can totally like make my game the next, you know, Cards Against Humanity, or, you know, or Telestrations or whatever. Like, I think that is a lot harder to do. And then you're really saying, I'm starting a publishing company. And then there's so many publishing companies, and are you really going to be able to talk to the same people that the app is talking to? And like, probably not.
Well, and also not to mention, you've got these publishers. I'm sure you guys have all kickstarted games before, from big publishers and small publishers. How often has a Kickstarter run from campaign to fulfillment without any hiccups and delivered on time? And this is the major publisher. You know, if the biggest publishers in the world are emailing you going, sorry, you're all really mad and that it's really late, it turns out this is really hard, and that's a huge company. Like, if you're going to do it by yourself or with one other person and you've never done it before, you're going to possibly have some big problems. And if you are somebody who wants to be just a designer and then you go through this and have all these problems, you may end up hurting yourself more than helping yourself, because you may end up being associated with a potentially disastrous campaign that doesn't fulfill. And that speaks nothing to your design skill for the game. The game could be fantastic, but if you bungle the distribution and fulfillment, it may sour a lot of people on you as a designer in the future. So it's a big risk, and it's not just a risk of the funding or whatever. It can tarnish your reputation if you do it poorly, or if you do it right and some terrible catastrophic thing happens that's none of your fault, but still ends up having people look at you in a negative light.
So
there are also some.
Go ahead, Eric.
I was just going to say, there's also, you know, there are also some alternatives that you can kind of use to gauge how well a Kickstarter would go. For example, like the Game Crafter has these things called crowd sales, and you kind of upload your game into the Game Crafter and then put it up for sale there. And the more people who buy it, the cheaper the game gets for everybody. And so your game is housed on the Game Crafter for that kind of like smaller print run, but that can give you practice like building an audience. You know, all those people who buy the games are kind of like on your email list then. So if you decide that you want to deluxify it later and get, you know, outside components and stuff, then, you know, oh, you bought my game, it's going to be so much better now that I have all this other stuff in it. And you can get practice, you know, tweeting out about it and generating excitement. So look at some other things that are out there as well. Like Juliana said, I'm on Kickstarter like all the time, too much. So I'm definitely not saying don't do it, because I need stuff to buy. So please do it, but also don't do it.
I think one of the jokes when we is Tate always says how he's got a bunch of games just hanging out in his garage that he hasn't been able to get rid of, right? So we've kind of touched on a little bit, but because we're online right now and everything's online, we're not able to go to conventions and network and do that. What Facebook groups and what podcasts and communities would you recommend designers to go join and to go seek out so they could learn more about becoming a game designer?
Well, one of the big ones on Facebook that got me through a lot of my early years of design is the Card and Board Game Designers Guild. That's on Facebook. Another Facebook group, Board Game Spotlight, is really big. That one's a good mix of design stuff, but also just like kind of like game fans. And if you have like a similar game, you know, we're talking about how much we love patchwork or whatever. I see a lot of times people in the comments like, oh, I'm working on something similar. And people are just like, oh, like, I love patchwork. Show me what you have. And then you can kind of do like these little micro pitches inside the comments. Yeah, those are two that I'm in a lot. I also kind of just like troll the art and graphic design for a tabletop group, even though I'm not an artist. I like seeing projects that people are working on. And sometimes there's like artists who just have like art and they need a game to go around that art. And so there's like opportunities all over the place if you look for them.
There's also the Board Game Design Lab. They have both a Facebook group, which is just a really lovely, encouraging community. And then the podcast as well he has a different guest on every week talking about different topics, and it's super helpful. And then Jamie Stegmeyer's blog is just a resource of like everything you would ever want to know about anything in the games world. And we're avid followers of that.
Yeah, those are all great. I'm just going to shamelessly plug that I have a podcast. It's called Making the Dough Show. It's from our Bread and Circuses. It's me and my partner, Nate Murray. And we talk about the board games industry from the industry perspective, from where we are, from making games or talking distribution or manufacturing or whatever it is that we're doing. So we do it kind of a behind the scenes look.
I tend to listen to a lot of review podcasts. Avoiding, of course, reviews of games I've worked on, but because that can be unhealthy. But what I like is podcasts where there's a group of hosts, particularly ones who know each other well. So like Secret Cabal Gaming Podcast, Blue Peg, Pink Peg, where you get sort of a familiar, friendly voices. You get to learn their opinions of games, but how they discuss as a group when they don't necessarily all like the same types of games, I find is really enlightening when designing a game. Especially if you can find a review they've done for something in the same genre of a game you're working on, is to hear how they discuss the pros and cons of a design, what they liked, where the game kind of fell flat. There's a lot to take away from that kind of insight and discussion and debate about a game. Because sometimes you'll have, a host saying like, I absolutely love that the game did X, Y, and Z, and someone else will immediately respond and say, oh, that was my least favorite part of the whole thing. Sure. But then they have to kind of discuss why, and it gives you some perspective as you think about the choices you're making with your own design. Is like, okay, if I make this choice, I'm making it knowing different audiences might perceive it in these different ways. And I found that to be really helpful.
We also like the On Board Games podcast. Donald Dennis does games in schools and libraries as well. And so that's kind of a different perspective to get, but also just an interesting, like Pat was just saying, hearing what they're playing, what they're liking about it. And then they have different guests on as well.
I think being active on Twitter as well is good. Following companies that you're interested in working with or pitching to. A lot of times, especially near conventions, even the online conventions, publishers will literally just post like, "Hey, we want to take pitches. Here's our email address." And like a lot of times, I've gotten meetings just from kind of scrolling through Twitter near conventions and. So yeah, kind of just be on the lookout for those sorts of things as well. But all of those, the podcasts that we mentioned are things that I listen to as well. There's another one, Hooked on Geek, that I like a lot. It's a husband and wife, Greg and Stephanie team. So they have a lot of like 2-player reviews, which are cool. And then it's also neat, as Pat was saying, because they don't always agree on things, and so you get that very healthy. Like knowledge of like, not everybody's going to like everything you do in your game, and that's fine. Like, audiences are different. So
cool. Those are all good advice. We're getting kind of toward the end here. The proctor at this point would be like 5 minutes left. So what we would do now is I would love for you guys to go around and talk about something that you're working on and what people should be looking out for, and then where they can find you online after the panel. John?
Yeah, so I can't super talk about most of the things I'm working on, but we had a couple of games come out recently that finished fulfilling from Kickstarters that I had pitched to publishers, and they ran Kickstarters. So Alchemists from Card Lords. It's a very family-friendly, very quick kind of engine-building game where you're playing as animals who are alchemists. And then I just had Grindhouse come out, which is a survival horror game. But it's also funny. So it's you're literally losing arms and legs as you're trying to make your way through a house of horrors. That if that sounds like it's up your alley, then you'll probably like this game. It's a very not family friendly, but party friendly. So you can sit down with 6 players, and it's very silly, but also you might lose your head. That one's from Everything Epic. It finished fulfilling around March, I think. So it should be available for purchase either now or very soon. And you can find us if you go to breadandscircuses.rocks, not .com, .rocks. That is our website for our team, for our design studio. You can find our latest podcast episodes or updates on what we're doing there.
Eric?
Yes, I have a game out now called Tattoo Stories. That's with Bicycle, who's kind of expanding their tabletop reach after making cards for like 120 years. I also have a game called Nerd Word Science. That's with Genius Games. And then coming this year, August, September area, I have a game called Monstrosity that I'm super excited about. You're basically forensic sketch artists trying to draw aliens and demons and monsters and stuff that somebody has seen but doesn't quite remember what it looks like. So I'm excited about that. That comes out later this year. I'm on Twitter and Instagram at Slauson Designs, SLAUSON Designs. And then all the games are available on Amazon or the company website, Bicycle, Genius Games. And then you can pre-order Monstrosity at the Deepwater Games website.
Pat?
Pretty much everything I'm working on is that can be announced is up on the op.games, which is our company site. Big things I'm working on right now that I can talk about, I guess, would be Quest of Yore, the game for Pixar's Onward film, which has been really exciting. Ross has been helping us with the testing on that one, which has been super fun.
I'm totally a Manticore in that right now. It's awesome.
Yeah. It's a good time. With a rich backstory besides, which is pretty funny. So that's been a lot of fun. That'll be out later this year. And social media wise, you can find me pretty much everywhere by looking for me at Dr. Pat Makes Games, Twitter, Instagram, and then of course company email for any outreach there is just pmarino@usaopoly.com.
Juliana?
I'm going to cede to Ariel.
Oh.
We have things, so I'm going to go first. So upcoming, we can't give a lot of details yet, but we have a social deduction game coming out from Arcane Wonders this fall that we're really excited about. We are a big, long time werewolf fans, so getting to do a social deduction game was kind of a dream of ours. And then we have a mystery game coming out from Renegade Games in 2021 that also that's just about all I can say, but also incredibly excited about, also comes from a deep-seated childhood passion of ours. And then right now on the topic of mystery, if you go to nancydrew.atxquest.com, the CW had us create a puzzle quest for their Nancy Drew television show.
Whoa,
Very
cool.
Completely free. We worked with the actors and the writers to create it. It's really fun. And you get to, you get sort of a backstage thing because the actors are part of it and they get to do some cool reveals and it's fun puzzles. So that's really cool and worth checking out.
I'm writing down another panel idea because we could totally have all the big puzzle people on and just talk about. Sorry, that would be super cool.
We will talk puzzles any day.
Cool, awesome.
And then in terms of other games that we have out right now, from Mattel, we have Escape Room in a Box, The Werewolf Experiment, and Escape Room in a Box Flashback. We also have Vampire.Pizza out.
We didn't get to it,
which
sorry.
we didn't get a chance to talk about. But essentially, it is literally pizza and salad and dessert delivered to you with
by a vampire.
By a vampire, with a game that invites you to become a part of the vampire revolution. So that's popping up in cities all over the country, I think. Probably in July, I'm not sure, but I feel like it should be up in LA and New York, and then maybe some other cities. So you can check out Vampire.Pizza there. And then we also have, if this is coming out in July, there's a good chance it'll already be up and running. The Santa Monica Pier here in California had us design a puzzle quest to give you a historical tour. So you essentially get all the history, you get to solve puzzles along the way. So if you go to the App Store and download Secret Story Tours, you will see the Santa Monica tour hunt there.
That's great.
Oh, and then about where to find us. Sorry.
Yeah.
We have so many things to plug. Sorry. So you can find us on Instagram at The Wild Optimists. We're on Facebook.com/Wild Optimists. And then we're on Twitter as Escape Room in Box, because Escape Room in a Box was too long. So we are at Escape Room in Box.
And our website is thewildoptimists.com.
There you go. Teamwork.
Great.
Or
Cool.
is it just Wild Optimists? Actually, it might not be a the.
It's not that. It's just wildoptimist.com.
I totally know my own website.
Well, thank you so much for all joining us today for this Comic-Con at Home virtual panel. It was great. I learned a lot, and it's always good hanging out. Thank you so much for joining us. And yeah, find out more about games and get designing. Make it happen. Cool. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.